Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending November 2nd, 2024. First up, first of a couple of stories from the Wall Street Journal, this one from the Risk and Compliance Journal, Connor Hart reporting that Alibaba has agreed to a $433 million settlement in a shareholder lawsuit. The claims were that the company hurt investors by making misstatements about its exclusivity practices. The China-based e-commerce platform, which denied any allegations, said in a regulatory filing it entered the settlement to avoid the cost and disruption of further litigation. Let me tell you, if you're paying $433 million, it's not because it's costly to defend. It's because you got a big problem. Next up, from the BBC, for those who wonder about the power of podcasting, well, it was a BBC podcast which led to the charges against former Abercrombie & Fitch CEO Mike Jeffries, the multimillionaire ex-fashion boss who the BBC reporter Rihanna Croxford spent 3 years investigating. He was charged this week by the FBI. Her podcast was called The Abercrombie Guys, in which she unearthed evidence that Jeffries and his partner had been at the center of a sophisticated global operation involving network of recruiters and middlemen scouting young men for sex. So we have sexual slavery, sexual trafficking, sexual harassment, and probably some rape thrown in. Next up from the Financial Times, the business unit president of AstraZeneca China is under investigation by Chinese authorities. AstraZeneca is one of the country's most high-profile pharmaceutical companies, and its China boss is one of the country's most high-profile pharmaceutical executives. The British drug maker said that its president is cooperating with the ongoing investigation. However, the statement did not clarify the nature of the probe. The pharmaceutical chief has been crucial to AstraZeneca's fortunes in China, where it generated some $5.9 billion in revenue in 2023, making it the largest overseas drug maker by sales in the country. The company said its China business unit would continue under the leadership of its current general manager, and if requested, AstraZeneca will fully cooperate with the investigation. I bet they will. Next up from Bloomberg, remember Trafigura Well, they are back in the news as they're preparing to take a $1.1 billion hit after discovering what it suspects fraud involving its employees in the Mongolian oil trading business. The loss could also force the commodity trading giant to restate prior earnings, coming less than 2 years after the company rocked the industry with a revelation it had lost more than $500 million in an alleged nickel fraud. The company said that some of its employees in Mongolia had manipulated data and documents to inflate the amount of money it had paid out, as well as deliberately concealing overdue debts over a period of 5 years. No word on whether there was some additional corruption allegations against Trafigura, but whatever it is, it's certainly a big not good. Sri Lanka, let's start with reported by Al Jazeera. Sri Lanka is probing the corruption in the handling of the 2021 cargo ship disaster, which polluted much of Sri Lanka's pristine coastline. Much of the settlement monies from P&I clubs in London was paid in cash and or in local currency, which the current government thinks that the prior government took its fat fingers and put in the middle of. So Sri Lanka is investigating that at this point. Next up from Bloomberg, it turns out UBS is still under scrutiny for Credit Suisse's actions in the Mozambique tuna bond case. The financial scandal that rocked Credit Suisse continues to haunt UBS Group, as Swiss prosecutors have revealed they opened a criminal probe late last year into the matter. The probe rejected an appeal by 3 unnamed bank units that sought to keep information sealed in an investigation into persons unknown. The probe is focused on a suspected illicit payment of $7.9 million into a Credit Suisse bank account that was sought by prosecutors. Next up, our second story from the Wall Street Journal. It turns out that audit reports do matter after all, as the Second Circuit Court of Appeals has reversed itself and decided that accounting firms' audit reports really do matter to investors. Gee, how can they on earth come to that decision? Perhaps a better question is, what idiots would have an audit report say that they don't matter to investors? Well, apparently the prior Second Circuit opinion, but at least they got it right this time. BDO is the defendant here, and they had argued that, you know what, our audit reports should not be relied on. Oops. Next up from Reuters, JP Morgan Chase has settled 5 enforcement cases brought by the Securities and Exchange Commission and agreeing to pay in total $151 million to settle them. The settlements include $61 million of civil fines and $90 million of reimbursements to customers. Next up from the BBC, a very troubling story about sailors who were forced into modern slavery on Scottish trawlers. A group of migrant fishermen recognized as victims of modern slavery have been awarded £20,000 each as compensation by the UK government. The Ghanaian crew were rescued in 2020 from the Scottish-owned scallop trawler Olivia Jean, owned by the Scottish firm TN Trawlers. The boat was part of a fleet owned by a Scottish firm, and the company was also recently named in a BBC documentary, Slavery at Sea. Now, the company has claimed we didn't know anything about this, but of course, turns out modern slavery was going on these trawlers. And our final story is that the chief of Olympus Pharmaceuticals, or rather Olympus Medical Equipment in Japan, was fired because he purchased illegal drugs. No word on what the drugs were. Happy weekend. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.